Maybe it's good afternoon. I want to go ahead and welcome you. There may be more people coming in, but I want to respect your time and get us started. So I'm delighted to welcome you to this. This is our last regular Faith in the City for this school year, although you'll hear some other kind of tidbits from Diane Lipset later. And we are particularly delighted to have our speakers with us today from the state level to help us understand some of that perspective. We all know that these are chaotic, confusing, difficult times, particularly for education. And I think one of the topics we've not spent much time on in our Faith in the City series is to think about how are those ever-changing moments playing out for our children that need special services. What is that doing to their ability to get the service and the educational access that they need? So we really wanted to visit that topic in some depth today. So we are very fortunate to have three speakers who not only bring their expertise as lawyers, but all three of them have also been in the classroom as teachers. I think that's a good combination for us today. And so I'm going to tell you just a little bit about them. Sylvia Oberly could not be here today. She is out of town. So I'm stepping in on her behalf to introduce these wonderful people to you. So we have from our Disability Rights North Carolina's education team, that's quite a mouthful, two folks, Elijah Moft, who joined the team in August of 2024. He's really focusing on ensuring that students with disabilities, no matter where they are, whether in traditional schools, other schools, even prison, are having access to what they need and can appropriate public education in the least possible restricted environment. Elijah got a BA in Africana Studies. You can ask him later exactly what that included, from Davidson College, a Master's of Education in Early Childhood Education from Johns Hopkins University, and his law degree from Chapel Hill. And we won't hold that against him if you're a Wake Forest fan. Prior to all of that, or at least to his work with the Disability Rights of North Carolina, he taught 5th grade in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. He's always been passionate about interrupting and lessening and eliminating, if possible, the systemic injustices that we face for children. Outside of his work, he likes exercising, cooking, discovering new music, figuring out how to be a great dad to his newborn child. How old is this newborn child?
Less newborn, but 2 months.
2 months.
10 months.
Okay.
10 months.
So here at Knollwood, we used to have a wonderful lady who says, "You never get over being pregnant." So that's our word of wisdom to you as a new dad. We also have another attorney on that same education team at Disability Rights North Carolina. And Glennis, you did say Higgins, right? I said it right, Glennis Higgins. Now, when I started looking at some of what she's done in her legal career, it's really been fascinating. While in South Carolina, she fought against using public funds for private school vouchers. Oh, yeah. She also was a housing advocate involved in several cases involving housing issues and access to housing and so forth, housing rights. But since she joined this particular team, she's been focusing particularly on advocacy for special education. She is a former high school English teacher. So we've got 5th grade, we got high school. And she is an alumnus of both the University of South Carolina Law School, across the street from where I grew up, and of North Carolina Central University. She likes reading and going to Zumba and hip hop step classes, so we know you're in good shape. You probably need to be in good shape in these particular days. And our third person is Carlton Powell, who is an attorney committed to holding North Carolina to its constitutional promise of providing our children with the opportunity to receive a quality education in free public schools. He is the interim director at Legal Aid of North Carolina's Right to Education Project. Yeah, did say that right. And he is also a former public school teacher and public defender and a graduate of Morehouse College. And he spent This is interesting, Carlton. I'm interested in it, that you're renovating a home that your great grandfather built in Warren County, North Carolina. Interesting. Afterwards, maybe you can tell some of us about that. Please join me in welcoming these two.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm gonna pull this a little bit closer because I am very short. So I'm going to just run through some of the slides right now that we have. They have the initial questions that we got from some of the people that were helping to organize this. We're gonna bounce a lot of the questions just off of us. So the slides are really gonna be here just to help guide the conversation. It has a little bit of statistics and stuff that are responsive to the questions that we had going in. So it is 50 years since the passing of the IDEA, which is part of the reason for this event. So we are celebrating that by talking about what we can do to uphold it a little bit better. So there are three major laws that help with students with disabilities in schools. The ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, which deals with reasonable accommodations, integration of people with disabilities into community settings, and physical accommodation. Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act, is a disability anti-discrimination law. And also allows for school accommodations for students. What we deal with largely is some 504, at least Glennis and I, and Carlton, I'm not sure about what y'all do, but most of the work we do is under the IDEA. And that provides an IEP, individualized education program for students with disabilities. It's a federal law. It is still good. It's still on the books, and we are hopeful that is going to stay the case. It looks like it will for at least the next year. But that is what we'll be talking about mostly today. But if you have questions about anything else, we are happy to talk about those as well. And so just want to give you a quick, very, very quick synopsis of some of the main parts of the IDEA that we will be talking about that provide those protections. So one is child find. It's very simply, the districts are supposed to be finding children with disabilities, whether or not they're in their schools, the public schools, so that they can provide them services. Having an IEP, which is what I just talked about, is the program that outlines the services that a student with disabilities is supposed to have. It's supposed to be individualized, it's supposed to make for meaningful progress, but it can include a lot of things. So we'll talk about some. Free appropriate public education, as you can see, it's a very acronym heavy area of law. It is FAPE is what we refer to it as, and that just basically means that meaningful progress part, right? Students with disabilities should not just be passing from grade to grade. They need to be making meaningful progress at an individualized. Part of that is passing grade to grade, but it is also making sure that they are getting these skills up to par with their non-disabled peers. Least restrictive environment, again, pretty simply, education in an environment with people that are not just disabled, with the general community, as much as in the general education environment as possible. Some instances that's not as possible, but you need to try every sort of intervention before that to allow an accommodation before then to allow a student to have that chance to be with their general education peers. And then there are discipline protections that we can talk about in more detail, but essentially if you're a student with disabilities, you have protections that you would not have if you were not a student with a disability, if you are suspended for more than 10 days. There's extra processes that are involved. So those are the basic parts of it. And if you have questions about those, we are happy to answer that, but I wanted to give you a bit of a framework so that we're working with it. So here were the initial questions, and I am happy to start bouncing around the mic for everybody. And we have some slides to help answer some of these, but we can kind of go, I think, to those as we get to each question. So I'll read out the question, and then Glynis, I think maybe you could probably take the first stab, and then Carlton, you can jump in, or you can go first. Whichever way you want to do it. We're all pretty expert on this, I think. So the first question was, across North Carolina, what percentage of our students are identified as eligible for special education and related services? What are the primary categories for such identifications and for what ages? Are these services equitably available across the state in both urban and rural areas? And then, Glynis, I think there's some slides that are helpful for this, right?
And while she's coming up, I also neglected to introduce one other person, Dr. Laura Holly. is our local director of special services for children with disabilities. And I asked her to come so she could comment as they go along, as it's necessary. For what's happening locally that might be impacting them. So they've got the statewide perspective and she can bring it home if we need that, okay? Thank you, Dennis.
All right, so the most recent data that we can find in terms of child count by disability for the state of North Carolina was from 2018, 2019. As you can see, the largest identified category for students is specific learning disability. So that's a disability in like a specific subject area, usually math or reading. And as you can see, that's identified around the middle school, secondary area. The next largest category is OHI, that's other health impairment. So that really just means that the child has a health issue that may impact. ADHD does typically fall under OHI, but it's not a limited category. It can really be expansive. And then the next highest category is speech or language impairment, which interesting, I know Elijah and I found this data really interesting. It is typically identified very early, ages 6 to 11. And I also, because the IDEA serves preschoolers, I imagine that number is also higher for that age group as well. But these are the 3 largest categories in the state of North Carolina. And I imagine the pandemic may have changed some of that identification process, but that was probably across categories. Since some school districts did try to delay identification during the pandemic since kids were in school. And so if you look at the federal data, it's pretty similar. So the federal data does look at ages 3 through 21. And as you can see, it follows pretty closely to North Carolina's data. And in terms of disparities across the state, so my answer to this is always, the IDEA is a federal law, so it's supposed to be applied the same regardless of what 115 school districts or the however many charter schools. I really don't know how many charter schools there are, but there are a ton. But the IDEA is supposed to be applied regardless, and all of the funding is going to be similar. And we'll talk about funding later and why the funding is similar from the federal level, but may not be similar. But as you can probably imagine, some districts have more funding to give to more things. Some districts have more options in terms of the least restrictive environment and the continuum of alternative placements that students can be in. So legally, from a legal perspective and a broad overview perspective, the IDEA is kind of an equalizer, but as we start to zoom in, I'm sure different communities have different ways of doing things. And I don't know if you want to weigh in on that for Winston-Salem Foresight.
I'll wait.
Okay. Any thoughts?
We also have the 1 in 7.
Oh, yeah.
Could you go over that?
Yes, 1 in 7, that's the number of students with disabilities who are identified. So yeah, it's a lot.
And that's on average. Nationally, it's hard to identify per state. The data collection is not perfect, but nationally it's 1 in 7, but it can get as high as 25% in some states. So there's a range.
So we would assume that regardless of category, they all should have an IEP.
And this is, yeah, that is just for students that would qualify for an IEP. This does not include students that would qualify for a 504 plan.
Right.
So yeah, it's even larger if you include that number of students. Yeah.
Any other questions on this slide? I think I mentioned OHI and ADHD, but I also want to say autism is its own category. I'm not sure if there might be any spillover. I know some of my students who have autism are identified under OHI as well. So, and I also want to say that some students can qualify for multiple disability categories. So there's their primary eligibility category, and then there can be secondary. And I think I heard one of my colleagues say that one of their clients had a 3rd disability category. So I will say, my mom likes to say it doesn't matter what category. I would beg to differ. But I think that the point of eligibility is to make sure that the child gets the services that they need. And so eligibility category can be helpful in making sure that the student gets the services that they need for their particular disability area.
I think if you go back a few slides too, you can see, yes,
Yes.
I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that or.
I can. So in order to be eligible for IDEA special education, the student must first have a disability, and that disability must interfere or impact their learning. And the child must also need special education and related services. And so that's how students become IDEA eligible. The process for 504 is a little bit different. In terms of that, like, it's not that neat special education. The thing that sets the IDEA apart is that the student must need special education and related services. And then, of course, here are the qualified disability categories again.
And I can ask a question. The children that have a lot of adverse childhood experiences, a score of 4 or 5, 6 or 7, which is traumatic, are they counted in any of these categories?
They very likely could qualify for services depending on their need, right? So it sounds like they likely would have some sort of disability based on that trauma, so they would need that first category. You would also have to show that they would have that their disability, their trauma-related disability has an interference with their learning, which you can show in a lot of different ways. It can even be as simple as they're not able to come to school for periods of time because of that, or they're having a hard time with social emotional skills, something like that. You can see that and show that in school districts. Sometimes in some districts have a harder time seeing those impacts when it's not directly with your grades. And it can impact your grades, right? But that is something that we see a little bit of difficulty in. And so then they would qualify, and oftentimes you might see them in the emotional disability category or the OHI category, other health impairment. But it really, it depends. They could be multiple. And Carl, I don't know what you've noticed with the students that you all serve in terms of what categories you've been seeing more so than others.
I can't say which categories we're seeing more so than others. I will say though that OHI is probably the one we see most. ADHD, we see a lot of emotional disturbance or emotional disability, which might be covered. You know, if the child has ACEs or it's a category that might be found eligible under ED. I will say too, you know, what we fight about as lawyers is whether or not a child should be found eligible. It's not a guarantee that just because a child has suffered serious trauma, or even if a child has a disability, that they'll have an IEP. It really comes down to a special education referral and then a meeting, an IEP team deciding whether or not that child should be eligible. When the child's not found eligible, a parent might come to us and then we fight about it if necessary. So there's an evaluation process. So it's not a guarantee.
I assume therefore that likewise, children that have an attention deficit or hyperactivity, it's only if it manifests in one of these specific areas that they are deemed to be needing of an IEP or special service, right?
If a child has ADHD or some other health impairment that impacts them on a daily basis, and we can verify that number one, there is a disability, that they meet the criteria that are outlined in the North Carolina policy. They meet that criteria, and we have evidence to show that the disability interferes with their learning. So it interferes with their ability to participate in the general education curriculum, to access the curriculum, to be a meaningful participant in the curriculum, not just be present in a location. If there's an impact there, and we can show through data, through evidence, that there is a need for specially designed instruction, which is special education, then that child would qualify as a child with disability and be given an IEP. Without those three things, you really cannot consider a child eligible for special education services in North Carolina or any other state, honestly. So those are the three things that have to be in place. So as you were saying, for OHI, we see a good bit of ADHD. We also, honestly, since COVID, we see a lot of anxiety related to, the stress that COVID caused families just across the board. And so we see a lot of that coming out, as a health impairment as well. And sometimes it does manifest, as you said, children who have ACEs who have been through many, many different traumatic things. We sometimes see them manifest as an emotional disability. It will generally manifest as emotional disability or an other health impairment. We see that more prevalent than other disability categories.
I have two questions, actually. One is something that you brought up. What about the student who does not have behavioral issues, but does have specific learning disability, so falls through the cracks because they don't get a lot of attention, but are 2 years behind? Does that student qualify for an IEP? Or is there resistance from the school because there aren't behavioral issues involved?
There should not be resistance from the school, because there are not behavior issues involved, because a behavior is not the thing, that qualifies a student for needing special education. It's any of these disabilities. And so a child that, like what you're describing, may have, a specific learning disability. They may have, a mild intellectual disability, just depending on the child and depending on the circumstances. But each disability category has a specific set of criteria that we as school districts have to operate under to find that first prong of whether they have that disability.
My second question has to do with parents. Have you ever encountered resistance from parents whose own educational experience stigmatized them, and therefore they really resist their child from being labeled that way? And what do you do? Any advice?
So I guess I'll take a stab at that first. In my role as a lawyer, that typically doesn't come up because by the time parents are coming to us, they're really concerned about their child's education. So, but as a teacher, I did see that resistance. And I actually, as I was going through my teacher education program, we were told multiple times, parents may not have the same view of the school as you. They may see school as a triggering place, as a bad place where they were often in trouble. And so we were told just to kind of meet the parent where they are. That's meet the student where they are, like meet everyone in the school building where they are. This is basically the gist. And in meeting the parent where they are and telling them, like, we're all here for the same thing. We all want to make sure that your child is successful. And, letting them know that you care about their child, I think really goes a long way. Parents are going to be resistant. I've seen plenty of Facebook posts about this, like, my child come home with bad grades. Now this teacher is trying to get them special education services because it is painted as a bad thing. But I think just reminding them that this is to help their child, not to label their child, is really important. But also, I'm not the only one with these thoughts and these experiences. So what are y'all's thoughts?
I'll see if parents and kids not want IEPs, they prefer 504 plans. Because IEP might mean child being pulled out of class and stigmatized, whereas a 504 plan is oftentimes a little more discreet in its application. You can remain in the class in the general education setting, but be provided accommodations that other children might not be able to notice or being applied, so that's what we might see sometimes when we're talking to parents about what their options are and the children, what their options are. They might choose something that's less.
Could you define them a 504 plan or whatever that is?
Yeah, sure. So basically, and I took out the slide that is such a good explainer of this. I'm sorry about that. But basically what a 504 plan is is that students with disabilities that need accommodations or modifications rather than specially designed instruction to access their environment, that's who gets a 504 plan. So a example might be a student who has a mobility related disability, but doesn't need like extra tutoring or extra social emotional needs met. They just need accommodations to get around the building. That's a 504. Now, if you need specially designed instruction, they need extra instruction on social emotional skills or academic skills or what have you, occupational therapy skills, which could apply to this person potentially, then you get an IEP and your services are more, you get more services essentially.
It also look like preparation seating, so it's not necessary, other children might not even know their child received an accommodation, the child sitting in a different location in the classroom. And maybe more time on tests, it's things like that, just more discreet than especially design instruction that's provided, pushed in or pushed out.
And I'll just one additional point, I appreciate that both of y'all have mentioned, like, there is real fear of stigma around it, and for good reason. And I know in our work, both when I was a teacher and now, you can see staff that are discriminatory towards students with disabilities. And that intersects as well with sex, race, gender, sexuality, and how that comes to play in that environment. So I think we all agree, like, we don't dismiss parents' concerns around that. I think our role is to explain, well, first of all, ask what they want, right? Because a 504 plan can sometimes be just as good as an IEP in certain instances. But also to guide them along of like, yes, that is a fear, but also there are these things that protect your child from that. And if that happens and the school's not doing anything, that is also discrimination, right? So there are our role is to guide parents.
I just, also from an educator perspective, I think that the educator has a great opportunity to sort of reframe for parents I'm not trying to put some kind of identification on your kid. I'm trying to make sure that your child has all the time she needs to take her tests. I just want to make sure that we get in writing that, that your kid gets everything she needs to be as successful as she can be, and that parents are at that table making those decisions. I think that's another piece that maybe parents might not realize going in, is that when we're deciding on what the accommodations are, you as the parent get to say, oh, yes, I do want my kid sitting in the front of the class, or, oh, I have concerns about this for XYZ reasons. So, just kind of thinking through approaching that as a parent and as an educator, it feels a lot better as a parent to hear like, let's work together to figure out how I can be the best teacher for your kid.
As a hearing impaired person, I need to advocate for myself. It would be really helpful to me if you all were using a microphone.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank
Sorry about
you.
that. Yeah.
Oh. Okay. You want me to advance slideshow, or do you have more thoughts on?
No, we can go to the next slide.
Okay, I believe that leads us to the second question, which is, how has the rise in private school vouchers in North Carolina affected the opportunity for students with disabilities and exceptionalities to receive a free and appropriate public education? Do vouchers help create private alternatives for students with disabilities? If not, why? All right. Voucher data.
Okay, so I'll just give a little bit, this is just a bit of data that I wanted to collect on this and show for everybody. I think it's good to have a visual representation of what we're kind of talking about here. So this is some voucher data from the NCSEAA. I could not tell you the actual acronym, but it is, do you have the actual acronym off the top of your head?
State education. Sorry.
Thank you. There's too much pressure for me to try to memorize that. So I appreciate that. But here's some data and some maps to help explain what the landscape is right now. So on the top left, and I apologize if it's a little bit hard to see, it's a little small. The top left, you can see a map of the counties that have received the most voucher money as of this year. the 2024-2025 school year as of April 2025. You can see it's a lot of the counties, the darker it is, that's more money, from vouchers. So you see Mecklenburg, you see, Wake, you see Guilford, you see Forsyth, you see Paris, I think that's what it is. Cumberland, thank you, yes. Grew up in North Carolina my whole life, you wouldn't be able to tell. And then on the map below, you can see this is the distribution of Black individuals in North Carolina per county, with darker counties being the higher population disproportionality of Black individuals in those counties. We also have race over here for, this is the recipients of the vouchers. And you can see that disproportionately recipients of vouchers are white in North Carolina. 73% of recipients of vouchers are white. This is up actually from 2 years ago, which I believe was 65% white. In North Carolina, that is, if you look down, obviously it's not just a binary racially, but I think just a snapshot here in terms of the Black-white distribution is pretty jarring, because the white voucher percentage in North Carolina, or Black voucher percentage is 11%, whereas in North Carolina, it's about 22% Black. So just as an overview of where the funds are going, where they're being used. So in terms of equity and access, that is just one aspect of this I think is important as a background. But a few other thoughts I have, and then I'll pass it on to somebody else, and we can kind of bounce it back and forth, is that to the question, let me go back to the question too, just so we have it all up there. Is do vouchers help create private alternatives for students with disabilities? General answer is no, because private schools do not have to follow the IDEA. They often, especially what you'll see is a mix of private and religious school as well, which means that they get additional protections from having to follow the ADA and the 504, section 504, I should say. There are, in limited instances, if you get federal money that you might be having to abide by the ADA or 504, you do have to abide by the ADA if you're a private school, but in limited scenarios, not to the same degree as the IDEA for specially designed instruction and things like that. But that confluence with religious private schools in particular provides a lot of insulation from the federal law's protections. So that, in short, no, it's not good for students with disabilities. There are limited instances where that's not true, but as a general rule. And I can bring the mic over now to start discussing.
I just add that, well, we don't typically represent students who attend private schools, not at legal aid. Our representation is conditioned upon whether or not the child is indigent, their income requirements. And obviously with the voucher program, that makes it possible for maybe students who couldn't normally attend private schools to attend them because they receive the voucher and go. We represented a private school child recently who, among other disabilities or disabling conditions, was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. The school could not provide her, the private school could not provide her the services that she needed. And so she left. She was on an opportunity scholarship. What I learned from that process, one is that not only does the ADA and 504 protect students from discrimination, that protection does include protections while the child is in a private school that's considered Christian, if the Christian school is not controlled by a religious organization. So there is an exemption, but if the school is not controlled by a religious organization, then that school is not exempt and must provide accommodations to a child with a disability. This is very important because there are a lot of schools, private schools, that identify themselves as being religious because they teach Christian values or, they teach the Bible, which is all fine, but they're not controlled by a religious organization. And so then that means they have to abide by the ADA and they cannot discriminate on the basis of a disability. This is really important. And this is built into the ADA. So the ADA specifically says you have to accommodate It mandates equal access to public accommodations. Private schools are considered places of public accommodation. Because they're places of a public accommodation, they have to make themselves available to children with disabilities. Now, if they are controlled by a religious organization, they do not. And so we have learned this. And so we are looking for opportunities to challenge schools, and schools will put it on their website, a private school, that we cannot serve your child. And it's explicitly, it says that, which is a denial of opportunity, a denial of participation, which is a form of discrimination. And so when the question is asked, how will private vouchers impact special education services delivery? Well, that's how, because we're not pressing them a lot on that. And so they're explicitly discriminating on the basis of disability. And so we anticipate seeing more of that, the more private vouchers become more popular.
That's a good segue right into number 3.
All right, sure,
Keep going.
okay.
So I always get the name wrong, so I spent a little moment Googling the exact name. So I want to differentiate voucher programs that are available in the state of North Carolina. So we have the Opportunity Scholarship, which is the one that everyone's kind of upset about. That's the one that became universal, I think I think for this school year, which is why that data jump is interesting. So now more families qualify for vouchers and they can use those vouchers at whatever school, regardless of their income, right? We also have a program called the ESA Plus, that is the Education Student Accounts. That is specifically for students with disabilities to help them find private schools that can better serve them. In fact, one of my former assistant principals and his wife, who's a former EC director, opened up a school specifically to serve students with autism or students with other disabilities who have difficulty in schools. However, that founding of schools that are, specifically designed to address students' needs is not a common thing. So while there is this scholarship that's wonderfully designed to make sure students get access to the services and supports that they need, there is a shortage of private schools in North Carolina that are designed to serve students with disabilities. So it's kind of at this oxymoronic place here where we have these programs that are set up, but there's no infrastructure. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. Y'all know where I stand on vouchers, but the infrastructure is not there even when these programs are designed to benefit and support students with disabilities.
Just to be specific about the ADA, that's Title III of the ADA. There are multiple titles. Title II applies to state and government programs. Title III applies to businesses and like public accommodations or businesses that are made available to the public. I mean, to jump to number 3, if you don't want to do that. I find this question is interesting for a lot of reasons. But one that I just became aware of is that the Department of Education was first came into existence in 1867. Did anybody know that? I didn't either, and it's worth looking into. It was short-lived, but it was open for at least 2 main reasons. One, because literacy was so high coming out of the Civil War, apparently, but also, obviously, we were coming out of the Civil War. This was Reconstruction, and the federal government, and particularly abolitionists, former abolitionists who were in the government, wanted to make sure that schools now that had to be open for formerly enslaved people were open for formerly enslaved people and were doing the business of educating them. So the purpose of the Department of Education in 1867 served those dual purposes. And it's interesting now that we're talking about, it came back and it went away, I forget how many years. It wasn't open very long. Closed down, it was reestablished in 1980 under Jimmy Carter. And in between there, I want to jump to something. I'm really kind of digging into history recently because of what's going on, particularly Reconstruction. But the federal government has had to involve itself in education because of states' refusals to educate specific populations. So if you look at 1965, for example, so it was 1867, there was the Department of Education was established for the reasons I just laid out. closed down. Various times throughout history, there was federal intervention in the public education. But in 1965, that was one of the, forget the act that was passed. I think it was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, I believe. And it was passed for the purpose, again, that was the time when we're trying to desegregate. We're really pushing for civil rights. That's the Civil Rights Act of 1965. The federal government had to involve itself once again to ensure that children in segregated schools, or now that will be in desegregated schools, are receiving the education they were supposed to receive. So there was necessary federal intervention then. The Department of Education wasn't created then, but then in 1980 it was. And not for the same reasons, but it just goes to show that there was a need from the federal government to involve itself, because the federal government believed that it had to involve itself to ensure every child in the states was getting the education they're supposed to get. Mind you, of course, there is a constitutional right to education. So it's just the dismantling, it's bothersome in the sense that you want to question the motivation behind it. It's not so bothersome in the sense that the education has existed without it. So what we really have to figure out, going forward, in my opinion, is how we're going to hold the states accountable, how we're going to make them provide the education we know that they're supposed to provide, particularly at a time when Leandra is happening. So we got to talk with some friends I disagree with about this. I'm gonna hand them over the mic because I'll talk about this forever. But they were, I was telling them what I do. They asked me how I hadn't seen him in a while. I said, your friend is cutting all our funding and is shutting down the Department of Education. And they said, well, isn't that a good thing? Because it's going to go back to the states. Don't you want that? I said, no, I don't. Because the states aren't funding my students. They're underfunding public education. So if we're going to leave these decisions in the hands of the state government, then, and we base how they act off of what they're doing with the constitutional right, what makes me think that they're going to properly fund or handle special education if the funding's given to them. I have no confidence in, and I'm not supposed to talk about those things. The fact is, I'm not talking about an opinion or a policy. I'm talking about what the Supreme Court of the United States has already said. So we're not allowed to talk about legislation or policy. We can't talk about the law. And so our Supreme Court has said that the state is underfunding our schools. Yeah. So if we know that, why would I think that they would properly fund special education programs? We need that funding to stay with the federal government. Well, I don't know where we go, actually.
Just about the Department of Education and special education in general. So the IDEA, the special education law, was enacted in 1975, which was prior to the reestablishment of the Department of Education, as he said, in 1980. And so the IDEA is where the funding comes from for students with disabilities. All of the things that I've read and the education, CASE is a national organization for special education administrators. All of the things I have gotten from there and from other sources that I've just been reading and trying to keep up with that say that we are not losing those federal dollars. Now, in saying that, I'll also say, and you guys can probably agree with this, that the federal government has never fully funded the IDEA since its enactment in 1975. But IDEA was there prior to the reestablishment of the Department of Education. I don't see IDEA going away. I think there are too many other organizations that would, I don't know, march on Washington or something. I just can't see it. I can't see it going away. I can't see. You've got all of the other things that protect students with disabilities. I don't see that funding going away. And right now, they are saying that it is protected in the things that I have read. So I don't want to go way off on that, but I'm not worried about that right now. I'd be a little more worried about how North Carolina is funding us, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, want to just, first of all, second everything Carlton said, and that was beautifully put, and I won't retrace those steps because I will do a terrible job. But I do want to point out a couple of things. So yes, the recent budget proposal that has been advanced by the White House does specifically say no funding cuts for special education. It does, however, and it does say IDEA is not going to be attacked, at least this year. The one thing it does say that is unclear to us right now is that it does talk about reorganizing special education rights in the absence of the Department of Education potentially. We don't know what that looks like, and that could significantly impact the way things are managed, funded, allocated. That is, that's a big question mark. But yes, it is a relief that they're not cutting it or wanting to get rid of the IDEA right now. One thought on that though is that we have, in hearing and thinking about this, have been realizing that the policies are not, the state policies reflecting the IDEA are not actually in law in North Carolina. They have not been passed as like a regulation or as a statute. And so if the IDEA were to go away, that would mean that we would be on very shaky grounds in terms of state policy. So that's something that we're working on, looking at with the legislature, trying to figure out. Some other people in our organization that work more directly with policy are trying to work on that end as well. And then just one quick anecdote about the Department of Education and the shaking up and trying to end it that impacted a case of mine in particular is that there is a part of the Department of Education called the Office for Civil Rights, and they are the one that upholds especially your 504 protections, but special education protections on a federal level. There was a lot of talk about defunding the Office for Civil Rights, and the proposed budget does cut their funding by about 30%, I believe, targeting particularly transgender youth as the reasoning that they're cutting that funding. They don't want to protect their rights, but that will impact the ability for the Office for Civil Rights to do anything. But in particular for a client I had, they had potential race-based, sex-based, gender-based, and disability-based claims that they were filing in the Office for Civil Rights. And essentially, we got guidance from the people working there that we won't be able to handle this unless you drop everything but the disability claim. So we couldn't do cross identity claims at all for it to move forward. That was on their word. Obviously, they weren't able to point to a policy around that, but they were saying this is not going to move forward in any sort of way or fashion unless you drop things in the time being. So that is an example of how things are, even with it functioning for students with disabilities, it is being impacted broadly.
Wow, I really don't have much to add, but I will just reiterate what's on the slide that although I truly, like others have said, don't trust the state of North Carolina to fully fund education, they are currently the ones who are footing the bill for students with disabilities and the services that they receive. As you can see, according to state DPI data, $1.1 billion of state funds were spent in 2023-24, as opposed to the $357.3 million that came from federal sources. So, like our EC director said, it is kind of wild to me that the federal funding for the IDA still has not achieved the goals that they set out to achieve in 1975. And so while they're shaking things up, could they shake a little bit more money to the states so that they can actually fully fund the IDEA?
What does the 14% mean? Oh,
Right, 14% is the percentage, approximate percentage of funds that go towards special education. So if you're looking at I'm not I'm an English teacher, I'll remember that. So based on the total amount of spending that goes to students with disabilities, 14% of that is federal funding. And it's on DPI's website. You can see the exact, I think it's like $1,500. Don't quote me, again, not a math teacher, but it's somewhere around there per student that's spent on special education from the federal sources. And then they also have all the other sources that go into special education funding on the website.
the state funds school districts at 13%. And so like in Winston-Salem, we have approximately 15 to 16% of our students are students identified with a disability. So our funding from the state accounts for 13% of our students. So was that 2.5 to 3% of our students with disabilities who have been identified that we are not receiving funding for. And so then we obviously have to look at other ways to fund for services for those students. And so, the funding the funding could use some help, I'll say. I do know that, the state director for special education services, Caroline Hudgens, I have heard her say that there are funding, changes that have been requested at the state level. It is in legislation now. Nothing has been passed to this point, but it would be a weighted formula instead of a flat formula. And my hope would be that if that passes, that would help us with more equitable funding for our students with disabilities across the state. But unless that passes in legislation, it won't happen. So, we do count on our legislators to, just to help with that. And then, just the funding formulas in North Carolina in general are different from some other states. And no state has the exact same funding ways, for districts to gain local funds for school districts. And so that's impactful as well.
Real quick, full funding is 40%, by the way. So you've heard us say what full funding is. So you can do the math there. They're providing 14% now. The federal government vowed to provide 40% when the IDA was first enacted. There are two congresspersons who proposed a bill to reintroduce the bill, because it's been introduced before, asking the government to fully fund it over time, not all at once. But and that's was Congressman Van Hollen and I think Fetterman. So you can look that up. That was just proposed recently, I think in April. I read an article in the Brookings Institute that said that fully funding the IDEA would not necessarily decrease disparities in funding across states. The formula for dispersing funds would need to change according to Brookings. So even full funding won't do it. There'll still be disparities between which states receive maybe $8,000 per student, and some that will receive only $4,000 per student. So that equation needs to change.
Just gonna read off the question. Number 4 was, I think, where we're at, and we kind of have been speaking on this, but if anybody else has any other thoughts, in what ways might the undermining of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives affect students with disabilities? And I've already kind of spoken a little bit about a personal example of somebody I've represented that has been an issue with. The other part I'll point out is that disability, and we were kind of talking about this a little bit earlier. Thank you for that reference of like, there are a lot of people that benefit from the IDEA that don't agree with other parts of what they're really talking about with diversity, equity, inclusion, that don't care about racial discrimination, that don't care about all the other aspects of discrimination, that afford a little bit of more protection to the IDEA, through some weird fellowship of people who might not be friends on those fronts. However, what I'll say is that I won't give my opinion on this. However, if you've seen the Director of Health and Human Services at the federal level speaking of students with autism, and speaking very, very in terms that would afford protections under Section 504, if a teacher said that to a student, is what I'll say. That is extremely concerning in terms of how students with disabilities are being seen and portrayed. And I'll also reiterate that students with disabilities are not all treated equally, for the reason that They are also Black students. They are also Hispanic students. They are also English language learners. They are also gay. They are also trans students that have other things that put a target on them or change the way that their disability is perceived by people. And so a lot of the work that we do at Disability Rights is for students that are being kicked out of school for behaviors. And the amount of the disparity in students that are being kicked out of schools for behaviors that are have disabilities are skewed very much Black.
Yeah.
Because of discrimination based on their race that intersects with their disability. And so the attacks on one part of the diversity, equity, inclusion formula are attacks on all of it, is how I would say. And I'm also probably not supposed to say that either.
I was just gonna ask, you all have been talking about students that you work with. Do you also advocate for teachers with disabilities?
No, our education team is specifically K through 12 students with disabilities focused. Now that's not to say if a teacher came in with a complaint about discrimination that we wouldn't take it. It's just our team isn't equipped to handle that. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
And let's see, I was gonna weigh in on DEI and the over-identification and under-identification of students. So if you flip back in your memory to the eligibility categories that we talked about earlier, there is disproportionate representation for students with disabilities based on race. So Black, Native American, and Hispanic students are over-identified in some categories. I believe specific learning disability is one of those categories, but you could probably find more exact and precise data on that. But then there's an under-identification in disabilities like dyslexia and autism and other disability categories. So I bring that to the forefront just because we know that Black students, Hispanic students, Native American students are already facing barriers in the school district. So when it comes to them being able to get additional services to help them become more successful, it's also often a barrier there too. And that goes back to some of the conversations that we had earlier about how parents engage with the school district and how those students engage with the school district. And I know from one of my students who was targeted for removal, ended up in an alternative school there. He was supposed to be getting education 2 days a week for 2 hours a day. That when we think about those students, that is further pushing them into the school to prison pipeline and not allowing them to flourish and grow as we know that they deserve. And so I just wanted to bring that conversation to the forefront and recognize that the undermining of DEI initiatives isn't just a name category or whatever. It's like these are going to have real impacts on real students.
My name's Diane Lipset. I'm a member of the planning committee and unfortunately the timekeeper today because we would like this to keep going. But I would like to ask whether any of you would take a brief answer to question 6. What kinds of advocacy or response are required in this moment? Any of that you'd be willing to give us a word there at the end?
And it is based on the earlier question about parent advocacy. So the IDEA centralizes student voices and parent voices. The IEP process cannot happen, the IDEA cannot work unless parents are involved. And so that means that parents can have their own advocates in the room with them. And I have to admit, I was in an IEP meeting last week where it was just like this wall of the school district and this like the family team. It was the school team and the family team. And could we agree? And I have to say, as a teacher, when I would be in IEP meetings, it did feel kind of weird to be on this, like, we're on sides. Mm-hmm. And often in the district I taught in Richmond County, so we're not talking about a particularly affluent area of the state, parents were often in those IEP meetings alone. And so I want to caution because I know that the IDEA is complex. And so I'm not going to ever recommend that you go learn the IDEA and then start speaking for parents in IEP meetings. But if parents would like you there to support and to share more information about a child you may know, I would say do that. That's I'm not gonna say easy area of advocacy, but that is an area of advocacy that I think parents would really appreciate that support because, like I said, I think some school districts do a good job. I don't want to like put all school districts down. Some districts do a good job of trying to engage the parents into conversation. But when things get really fraught, and the more fraught they get, it becomes like the parent feels like they're on an island by themselves. And when they get to that point, they really need support. And so we're only a team of 5. So we can't be in all 100 counties on any given day, but there are community members like you all who really support families. And so if there's ever a situation where someone's like, hey, I've got this difficult IEP meeting, you can be a means of support there.
Can I just respond, just one minute?
Microphone, please.
Oh, sorry. You know, as the executive director of Exceptional Children's Services here in Winston-Salem, I also want to say, contact our office if there are questions or concerns. We want to be a collaborative partner with parents in the process. So if any parents are not feeling that way in our school district, specifically here, let us know, let me know, let someone in our office know so that we can help work through that, because we don't want it to feel like you described as parent team here, school team here. It's all about the student. It's not us and them. It's all focused on the student. That's the important thing there.
Thank you so much. And would you help me thank Glennis Haggins, Elijah Moff, and Carlton Powell. We presentation followed by Q&A, but you made this dialogical throughout, and we really appreciate that, and your time and your expertise and your advocacy, not an us and them situation, but in it together. So thank you. This is our last regular Faith of the City for this kind of academic year. We will be back in the fall, but we have a couple of summer offerings. That's unusual for us to do programming in the summer, but please save the date and watch for more information. On July 9th, we get to partner with a whole team of community advocates for educational equity in bringing the executive director of the Children's Defense Fund to Winston-Salem. Dr. Starsky Wilson will be here on July 9th and will give an evening presentation before spending July 10th at Freedom Schools. It's an important community program. And then August 12th, we have the privilege of partnering with Muse and with Bookmarks to bring author Karen Benjamin to Winston-Salem, the author of Good Parents, Better Homes, Great Schools. So we'll be distributing more information about the summer opportunities. We want to thank you for being here today and being part of this important conversation. Thanks so much.